So good morning. So a couple things going on. Firstly, let's start with the Parsha. This week is Parshat Pekudei, which means counting. And it begins with, this week is the last Parsha of the book of Exodus, second book of the Torah. So at the end of this week, we will be 2/5 of the way through the Torah, 2 out of 5 books down. It begins with Hashem Moshe counting the donations for the temple, how much gold there was, how much silver there was, how much copper, and then goes on to tell us how Bezalel, the lead, today they call him contractor, in charge of building the temple. Last week we spoke about how he built all the items of the temple. This week he tells us about how he made all the various clothing for the Kohanim, for the priests, and then it also tells us. It then also tells us how he brought the Mishkan and everything in it to Moshe, and he showed everything that he made. Moshe inspected everything, and then they erected it. They put it all up, and then when the Mishkan was standing and running, then Hashem's presence came down into the Mishkan and was found in the Mishkan. Yes?
Did they also dress the priests?
They dressed the priests as well, yes. But that's not going to happen until later, in 2 weeks' time, Parshat Tzav, when they inaugurate the temple, and then the priests actually get dressed. Here they just put it up in this week's Parsha, and it concludes how the cloud of glory fills the temple, and then next week's Parsha is going to open with Hashem speaking to Moshe. Well, that is the primary Parsha. However, we do take out a second Torah. It is the 4th week over the last 5 weeks that we took out a second Torah. This week, the extra Torah is we read a portion called HaChodesh that speaks firstly about the new moon. The new moon being the new month of the year, and according to our sages, Hashem then commanded Moshe in the mitzvah of the Jewish calendar and how to make a calendar. The Torah itself doesn't give us details of the calendar, but our oral tradition, we have to have a calendar since there's many dates in the calendar mentioned in the Torah. Our old tradition gives us the details of what those dates should be in the calendar, how the calendar should be structured. And then Hashem continues to tell Moshe in the desert, in Egypt, all the instructions for making the Passover animal that they're going to separate, a sort of a sacrifice. There wasn't really an altar, but they were going to separate and slaughter on the eve of the day before the Exodus, when Hashem will pass through the Egypt and smite all firstborn Egyptians and save the Jewish homes, and they will take the blood and put it on their doorposts. And so all the instructions for Passover are all given there in Parshat Bo. So we read that whole reading always the week before the beginning of Nisan in order to give you a refresher on the rules of Passover. They would read this reading back in temple times when everyone would actually bring the Passover sacrifice, but it also mentions rules such as not eating chametz and eating matzah as well are mentioned in this reading. So that's the second Torah that we read. I should mention next Sunday will be Rosh Chodesh, the new month, when we will welcome the new month of Nisan. Nisan is the month of Passover. Passover will be exactly 2 weeks later, starting Saturday night, or really 2 weeks from yesterday. 3 weeks from yesterday will be the first night of Passover. And mentioning that, I'd like to mention once again that, I mentioned this last week, a couple things. Firstly, we will talk more about Passover as we get closer to Passover. Hopefully not next week, but the following week we'll talk in detail about the various rules of Passover and customs, and we have a class dedicated. We'll talk to a Passover theme, the Seder plate. It is important before Passover that we do not own chametz on Passover, and so therefore, in order not to own chametz, you ideally should destroy everything. Sometimes we don't want to destroy all the chametz that we have, so in order to avoid that, we've had a workaround that we've been using for a very, very long time, where we sell our chametz to a non-Jew who is permitted to own chametz over Passover. Rather than doing it ourselves and trying to find a lawyer to do it properly, the easiest way to do it is to simply sign a form where you appoint the rabbi as your agent to sell your chametz on your behalf. So I have these forms. I'm going to pass them around. I didn't have pens, but hopefully some of you have. I'm going to pass them around, and you can sign a form and then continue passing it and give them to me after the class. We also, I mentioned previously many times that it is a mitzvah at the Seder to eat the handmade shmura matzah. That is both handmade and the wheat is watched from the moment of harvesting. And so we firstly sell shmura matzah for anyone who wants at our store. And we also distribute small boxes of shmura matzah with 2 matzahs in each box, 1 for each Seder. And we will be distributing it out once again to the entire community. Once again, we need volunteers, and anyone who is able to volunteer to distribute matzah, please do let me know. And then one final thing for Passover, just kind of early preparation, is that it's important that every single Jew go to a Seder on Passover. It is the day that the Seder is when we continue our tradition, pass on the tradition to the next generation. So it's important that everyone, especially children, join a Seder. If you are making a Seder, invite others to your Seder. If you are not making a Seder, planning to make a Seder on your own, please come to ours. We will be making a Seder here at the JCC. And if you know any other Jews not making a Seder, please invite them to come. We welcome all Jews to come to our Seder. We have a fee we're charging because Passover food is extremely costly, but we don't want anyone to be dissuaded from coming to the Seder because of the fee, and therefore anyone who is unable to pay the fee, let us know, and you're more than welcome to join us for our Seder. Any questions? So then let's get straight to our topic for today, which is the Kollel, the institution or the school for advanced Jewish studies. What is a Kollel? So from the earliest days of Judaism, we have built schools for children to be educated in Judaism. This goes back to early days of Judaism. Various people are mentioned, Shimon ben Shattach and Yehoshua ben Gamla. Various names are mentioned from Second Temple period, people who helped establish school systems. So we have always had schools to educate our children in Torah, teach our children, of course, to read and write, but also teach them to study the Torah. Most students only studied elementary school or so till they were 12, 13, and then they moved throughout history. And then they went to work, right? Till fairly recently, it was normal for teenagers to go to work. However, promising young men would continue their studies in what was called a yeshiva. Yeshiva, which we've done classes previously on yeshivas, and hope to do another class in September on a particular yeshiva. But yeshivas were places where students could study as teenagers, essentially equivalent to high schools, and then there were advanced yeshivas for essentially what we'd call today, not exactly the same, but similar to the post-high school study, where students would be able to continue their studies in advanced studies. And there have been yeshivas in virtually every community around the world throughout all of our history. The structure of how the yeshivas were structured changed in different times and different places, but they always in one form or another existed. The yeshiva was always the center of Jewish scholarship. It was a place where Jewish scholars taught, where students studied. Often yeshivas included advanced Jewish scholars, great scholars, what we call in Hebrew Talmidei Chachamim, that taught, that were experts in Torah and taught the students, sometimes people who were just studying and doing research on their own, similar to modern universities that have both professors teaching and people doing research. And so yeshivas always have that throughout history. However, in the last 80 years or so, a new phenomena has grown called the Kollel. The Kollel is a school for scholars to go to after yeshiva. So after they leave yeshiva, those that want to continue their studies go on to a Kollel. Today there are hundreds of Kollels. They tend to be much smaller than yeshivas, often with a dozen or a few dozen scholars studying. But there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Kollels around the world, and tens of thousands of students studying in Kollels. The Kollel is primarily for students who have families for them and allows them, while they're providing for a family, to continue study. So how did the Kollel develop and how does it work? So throughout Jewish history, there were, as we mentioned, every Jewish community had a yeshiva, or every major Jewish community had a yeshiva. There were always central, large yeshivas in large communities. During the days of the Second Temple, was in the land of Israel. After the Second Temple, for about 800 years, there were yeshivas in Babylon. Later, throughout Europe and North Africa, in the Middle East, there were various yeshivas, both what we'd call kind of the equivalent of high school, lower level yeshivas, as well as advanced kind of post-high school yeshivas. These schools were usually provided for by the community. In fact, communities often would commit to providing for a yeshiva with a certain number of students. So in other words, in the community charter or in the community agreements, it would say how many students the community was committed to providing for. There were costs involved in the yeshiva. It included usually paying the teachers. You need full-time teachers. Those teachers need to get paid. You also need to provide basic needs for the students. Sometimes the students were living at home if it was in their hometown. Often, especially for the advanced yeshivas, the students were from out of town. So they needed to be provided for with shelter, food, clothing, and they needed a place to study, which was usually pretty easy because they usually studied in the local synagogue or the local Beis Medrash, house of learning. Sometimes these costs were provided for by communities. Sometimes they were provided for by the families themselves, especially if the kids still lived at home. Some yeshivas charged kind of tuition fees for students to come, and sometimes they were provided for by private donors. Many communities, especially larger and more affluent communities, boasted very large yeshivas, very large schools that they were able to support, both paying teacher salaries, sometimes paying for advanced scholars to study as well, to maybe teach a little and study, paying for the needs of the students, giving them shelter, food, clothing, and their basic needs. So this worked generally for young students who were single, didn't have a family of their own. They only really needed food, clothing, and a place to sleep. Clothing in those days, people wouldn't have a lot of clothing like today. People had one change of clothing that they would, maybe when it wore out after a year or two, they would get another change of clothing, right? That people didn't have a lot of clothing. They did need to eat. And there were various systems. Either the yeshiva itself provided food. Often what they would do in communities is the students would take turns going to different families. So every family in a particular town would host a student once a week or twice a week, and that way, the students every day, their food would be provided for by a different family. However, and they needed, of course, a place to sleep. Some places had dormitories of some sort. In many places, the students actually slept in the synagogue or in the Beis Medrash on the benches. That's how they studied. That's how they lived. Hard for us to imagine today, but it was the norm in many, many communities, and that's what they did. However, once a student would get older, they would get married. Back in the day, people would get married fairly young, and now they had a family. So you couldn't really continue in yeshiva because you needed not just food, clothing, and shelter for yourself. You needed to provide for a family, for your wife and the children over time. So generally, communities would be a lot more expensive to provide for someone who has a family, for them to continue studying. So there was a system where sometimes communities, sometimes donors would pay stipends for students, promising students, and this was only for the best of the best, the top of the top, to continue their advance their studies. Now, sometimes what would happen is the scholars would actually go get a job, work full-time and study at night, work part-time and study part-time, but that really limited how much they could study and how far they could advance. So over the years, a system was established that became known as KEST. In KEST, essentially, it means that someone who wanted to study once they had a family and continue their studies, perhaps they wanted to become a rabbi, and so they needed to continue their studies for a couple more years. They wanted to become a teacher in a yeshiva, so they needed to really advance. Just graduating from a yeshiva was not enough. And so what they would do is they would find a patron who would support them, give them a stipend for a couple years as they continued their studies. And they continued to study, usually focused, if they were planning to become a rabbi, focused particularly on halacha, on practical law, often doing an apprenticeship with a rabbi to actually get real life practice and experience. And that way they would have someone would pay them a stipend to allow them to live for a couple years while they continued studying. Now, it's hard to find a patron that's going to pay you a stipend. Most often it was family. People from wealthy families who wanted to continue on becoming a rabbi were able to do it. The other solution for someone who wasn't from a wealthy family, if their spouse was from a wealthy family, then their in-laws could pay them a stipend to continue studying. And this created somewhat of an elite system where promising young students would look for, who wanted to continue their studies so they could become a rabbi, would look to marry girls from wealthy families so that they would, as a condition to the marriage, would stipulate that their father-in-law or whatever would pay them, would provide them a stipend for the next 4 or 5 years, or however, sometimes even 10 years, for however long they felt they needed to continue their studies. And so this really created a strong, and this was very strong in Europe, a strong bond almost between, in this elite group of scholars and wealthy families, where daughters of wealthy families were highly sought after by scholars, and in return, people who were very wealthy were able to afford to have a scholar as a son-in-law that they could then continue paying a stipend, and then they would eventually become hopefully a prominent rabbi. So it kind of skewed the system, creating this very elite group within the Jewish community of scholars and wealth together, that tended to go together as a result. So it was a challenge, but that is the way some people struggled through it, working, and they didn't have the resources, they didn't have a patron. Some people were able to find just a random patron who believed in them and paid their needs. Often wealthy people would kind of have a couple people that they would just sponsor their studies. Some people, struggled through it and, lived very poorly, working part-time, maybe studying at night, so studying part of the day in order to eventually, advance in their studies and become a great Torah scholar, maybe eventually becoming a rabbi usually, or a teacher in a yeshiva. So the Kollel was created to offer another option for people with families to continue their Torah studies. So scholars, kind of the top of the yeshivas who wanted to continue, the Kollel created an opportunity for them to continue. So the term Kollel actually means federation. So the Kollel actually started in a totally different context. Before it became a center for a school for advanced studies, it was originally actually something totally different. And the story of the Kollel actually goes back to 1777. When two great Hasidic leaders from Russia, Reb Mendel of Vitebsk and Reb Avram Kalisker, led a group of 300 Hasidim from Russia to move to the land of Israel. Now, over the years, there had been many, many attempts of various Jews to go to the land of Israel. Most of those attempts were by individuals. Someone here, someone there. The land of Israel throughout most of the years, since the destruction of the temple, was mostly desolate, was mostly very, very poor, with no industry to speak of. Not a lot of people living there. Few people that living there were Arabs, and there were different times that Jews went in large numbers to the land of Israel. Usually, when things got better for Jewish people, but there had never been a very, very large Jewish community. There were in 1777 when the Remendel of Vitebsk or Avram Kalisker led a group of Chassidim to Israel. They led a group of 300 followers moving to Israel. So this was a very large group, and it was the beginning of a new trend of large groups of people from the diaspora moving to the land of Israel that would continue throughout the 19th century, which would allow the Jewish community in Israel to grow from where it was in 1777, about 6,000 people. Remember, in a land that probably had less than 50,000 people in total living there, to grow to a massive Jewish community by the end of the 19th century, numbering well over 100,000 people by the end of the 19th century. Now, the Hasidim going to Israel, remember, Israel is backwater place. There aren't really farms there, and the Hasidim were not really known to farm, and there isn't really any industry to speak of. There isn't really a population. There really isn't much way to support yourself there. So when the Hasidim went to Israel, what happened was one of the leading Hasidic leaders at the time, Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi, known as the Alter Rebbe, we once did a class about him, he started a fund where Jews in Russia will send money to support the pilgrims or the people who had moved to the land of Israel. So they started this fund. They made it was very organized. Actually, that's when the charity boxes began. They started giving out these boxes. People could give to charity, and they had various people in every town. There was a Israel fund, was called then Ma'ot Eretz Yisrael, Ma'is Eretz Yisrael, money for the land of Israel. There was an Israel fund collector in every town, and then the people in the towns would bring it to the large city nearby, and then there would be a collector on behalf of the fund across the entire community that would, that across all of Europe, that would go around, collect the money from the various people in charge in the different places, and then eventually bring it to the land of Israel. In Israel, the Jews who were there, the money was given to the leaders of the community. The Jews who were there would then give them each a stipend, would be given to the people who were in the land of Israel. And that's how they lived. That's how they supported themselves, buying food and clothing or whatever else they needed from the local Arabs. Meanwhile, what did they do all day, these people? They were not working at all. They were living on a stipend. So they lived by, they spent their days studying Torah. So these were people who essentially spent their whole life. The Aliyah, the movement to Israel in 1977, was just the first. Following that, there were multiple more Aliyot, multiple more groups that moved to the land of Israel. First, mostly Hasidim, then later non-Hasidim, Misnagdim moved also in large numbers. But what happened was, over the next 20 years, the community land of Israel grew, so did their needs. But what happened is, while the original Hasidim that went from what was then called Rysin, or today would be called Belarus, the other people went from other areas, from Lithuania, from Ukraine, from Poland, from other areas of Eastern Europe, all part of the Russian Empire, but other Jews went from other areas to the land of Israel. And so, as a result, the community land of Israel was growing, their needs were growing, they had to raise more money, and so they started going to these other places where there were Jews had come from, to Ukraine, to Poland, to Lithuania, and collecting money there also for this fund. It was getting too much, and they were collecting from too many different places. So in 1796, it was decided to split the fund in two. The Jews of what today would be Belarus, it was all part of the Russian Empire, that the Jews of Belarus and Lithuania would be funded by one fund that was called Kollel Rysin. Rysin is Yiddish for Russia, the Russian Federation. And the Jews of Poland and Ukraine would be funded by another fund. The Jews from Poland and Ukraine living in the land of Israel be funded by another fund that was called Kollel Volyn. Volyn today is a province in western Ukraine, but it was then a term for Poland and Ukraine, and so it was the Volyn Federation. And so these were two federations. Essentially, they created two federations, two different funds. Each community, each kind of region had its own fund, and they would collect money within their own region, and they would send money to Israel to support people that had come from their region and were now living in the land of Israel and studying Torah.
Excuse me, what did they do besides study?
They spent their days studying.
And I don't understand.
They're living in an area. They're living in this. These were people who usually were scholars to start with, pious people who had made the decision to move to the land of Israel. They're living in an area, in a place where there is no industry. There's virtually no option of making money and getting jobs. The little businesses, there's a few Jews that are farmers, a few Jews become, storekeepers, but most of them, there's no option. They came with the intent of spending the rest of their lives studying Torah.
And what did they do with all that information that they now had in their heads?
It's a mitzvah to study Torah. It's a great mitzvah to study Torah. We believe that ideally we should study Torah all day. It's of course not realistic, and it's a great ideal. We believe further that we should have people studying on behalf of every community should have Jews studying overall, in other words, developing advanced scholars, just as in universities we have advanced scholars studying all sorts of different topics and funded by our government, by our universities, by private donors, because that advances scholarship overall. We should have advanced scholars studying Torah who advance scholarship overall. But these were people who essentially were dedicating the rest of their lives. They knew going to the land of Israel that there would be no options of a career, and they were making a pilgrimage to the land of Israel with the goal of dedicating the rest of their lives to spiritual pursuits. So over time, though, the Kollels split further. In the early 19th century, Kollel split over disagreements. One half became known as Kollel Chabad, the Chabad Federation, which is a charity that still exists today. There were over the years, other Kollels, other federations for other regions developed. There was a Kollel developed for Lithuanian Jews, later a Kollel developed for Galicianer Jews from Galicia, which was Western Ukraine, Southern Poland. There was later a Kollel for Hungarian Jews. A Kollel was built for German Jews, a Kollel for Dutch Jews. So essentially, over time, every major European Jewish region had built its own Kollel, its own federation, which was essentially a fundraising apparatus that would raise money and then pay stipends to people from their region that were living in the land of Israel. Remember, by the late 1800s, there were tens of thousands of people on this system that were studying and living off these stipends. And so large monies were raised by many, many different Kollels, many different federations. Over time, in the late 19th century, Zionism began with a new idea to actually try to develop the land of Israel. There was a pre-Zionist movement, Bilo already a little earlier, that started building farming towns and cities in the land of Israel. The goal was to make eventually the land of Israel self-sustainable, to eventually be able to build a state. And so slowly Jews began moving away from this stipend system, although there were still many on the stipend system. But Jews slowly began moving away from the stipend system to development. And Israel slowly began to develop. Eventually, the city of Tel Aviv was built in the early 1900s. And then later, other cities were built, industry was built, and then the land of Israel began. The swamps were drained, farms were created, kibbutzim were created, and the land of Israel began to have an economy, a stronger economy. It took a very long time until Israel built a strong economy, but they had an economy and there were other options. Now, at the same time, in Europe, there were yeshivas, as there had always been, both schools, they usually went till about 12, 13. There were yeshivas for advanced study for promising students, what we'd call today high school age or lower level yeshivas. There were higher level yeshivas for what we'd call today post-high school, a university level. And however, there was always this challenge that anyone who wanted to continue their studies once they got married would need to find a patron, either they came from a wealthy family, marry a girl from a wealthy family, or find somebody who would support them. Or another option some people did is they chose not to get married. They would get married very late, which was rare in the Jewish community, but they knew the only way they could continue their studies, if they wanted to become a rabbi, they wanted to become an advanced scholar, would be they would not be able to support a family while studying. In 1877, Rabbi Yisrael Salant, who was a great rabbi and famous for having started what became known as the Musar movement, he lived in Kovno in Lithuania. He really wanted to help students in Europe who wanted to study advanced Jewish education, advanced Jewish studies, while providing for their families. In other words, give an opportunity to others who maybe don't have a patron to support them. He wanted to give them an opportunity. And so what he decided is, the same system we have to support people who went to Israel, and primarily the reason why people went to Israel was not as a way to study for the rest of their lives, but it was because they had this longing to go to the Holy Land and live in the Holy Land. And essentially, once you were living in the Holy Land, there was nothing to do there besides study. But he felt that same system could be brought back to Europe, where you could raise money from the local community and have the local community support a small number of scholars who will then continue studying and get a stipend for studying. So he built the first Kollel in the city of Kovno, where he paid married students for 4 years to continue studying. And they studied advanced halacha, Jewish law, in preparation to become community rabbis. And they also would do apprenticeship with rabbis, where they would essentially learn practical rabbinics. And this was a very, very successful program. It was paid for. Kovno was a large Jewish community. It was funded by the community in Kovno, and it became very successful over the years. Many, many famous rabbis went through this Kollel, where they were funded by the community, but they were able to get a stipend and therefore spend an additional 4 years studying. In 1886, a little over a decade later, Reb Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who was the Rosh Yeshiva, the leader of the most prestigious and largest yeshiva of the day in the town of Volozhin in Lithuania, decided also that his students had a similar problem. They would study, it was a school for advanced studies. So it was kind of a post-high school school, but most students were there for 3-4 years, and then they would go home and usually find a job, get married, and move on. And again, similar problem. Most students were not able, unless they would, had a patron somewhere, privately arranged, they were not able to continue their studies. They wanted to become rabbis. And so he decided to create a system for it. And so he opened a Kollel, copying the Kollel in Kovno. He opened a Kollel there for advanced studies. Again, this is a Kollel that would be for advanced studies. It would not just be a school where you would have to pay tuition or maybe be allowed for free under a scholarship, but you would actually get a stipend for studying that would allow you to live. The Kollel in Volozhin became known as the Brodsky Kollel because it was funded Volozhin was a small town, essentially, with a very large school that was funded by donations from around the Russian Empire. But this Kollel was single-handedly funded by Yisrael Brodsky of Kiev, who was one of the wealthiest Jews in the Russian Empire at the time. He dominated the sugar business in the Russian Empire, the largest sugar business. And so he agreed to fund the Kollel entirely. So it became known after him as the Brodsky Kollel. And this Kollel continued for many, many years, all the way till World War I. So, so there were some kollels, again, starting in Europe already in the late 19th century, continued into the 20th century. It wasn't a common thing, but there were a handful of them, of kollels. Meanwhile, at the same time, the late 1900s, in the land of Israel, there's still a chalukah system, there's still a kollel system where communities from around, as they had done for 100 years from around Europe, are supporting Jews studying in the land of Israel. But it was fraying as the land of Israel was developing, slowly, very slowly. It took a long time for the land of Israel to develop, and with a lot of hardship. It didn't happen overnight. But in the early 20th century, already the land of Israel was developing. Many people who were going to the land of Israel were not going to study full time, but were rather going to work. And to work the farms. They were working hard. Many of them died from disease in the farms. Or were going to build industry, build factories. They were going to work. And many of the children who were born in the land of Israel, who some for generations had lived off the Kollel, now had other opportunities, or would go out to towns, villages, to work. All right, they were able to get jobs. So while there was still a chalukah system, it was definitely there were many other options for Jews in the land of Israel. However, in the 1950s, a new kollel system arose. The 1950s, following the Holocaust, and a number of other challenges, the forced expulsion, the Holocaust, the forced expulsion of Jews from the escape from most Jews from Eastern Europe, forced expulsion of Jews from Arab lands, the destruction of the Jewish community in what had now became the Soviet Union, all these problems that faced assimilation in the United States and in new countries, all these problems led to a big lack of rabbis. In the 1950s, there were simply not enough rabbis to go around for all the Jewish communities who needed them. Definitely not qualified rabbis. There just weren't that many yeshiva students. And even students who graduated yeshivas were not usually in position to be rabbis. You didn't become a rabbi just because you went to yeshiva for 3-4 years. And there really were not too many people who were studying advanced Jewish studies. So there was a need for more advanced studies. And as a result, a number of schools, organizations, both here in the United States as well as in Israel, opened kollels, named after, again, the same federation that they had of communities that would support people in Israel to study. And these were usually small kollels for the top promising students that they can continue studying with a stipend for a number of years. And this would provide opportunity for these people to then go and open their own yeshivas, for them to become rabbis in Jewish communities, and there would be more opportunities. These kollels generally were focused on practical rabbinics, so practical halacha. They often would get smicha, would get ordination as part of the kollel. They would give the students, and would work towards rabbinic ordination, and they would get practical rabbinic experience as well, usually in the kollels. And this really helped 1950s, 1960s, when there was a huge shortage of rabbis in the United States, in Israel, in other places. The growth of these kollels really led to a growth in rabbis and advanced scholars within the Jewish community. In 1962, the Rebbe opened a kollel for Chabad students in Brooklyn for the advanced students. 2 years later, he opened one in Kfar Chabad in Israel, again for advanced Chabad students in Israel, that they, again, to produce rabbis, that there should be rabbis that could go out to communities, advanced rabbis, that could go to large communities, people that have rabbinic ordination and can then lead the community as rabbis. In the 1970s, a new idea began. There were most Jews in the United States lived in a handful of places. Most lived in New York, or the New York region, and a handful of other big cities around. In the 1970s, Los Angeles was still a very small Jewish community. they mostly lived in a handful of Jewish communities, either in the Midwest or on the East Coast, and that had kind of larger Jewish communities, Philadelphia, in Boston, in Baltimore, in Chicago, and a couple other large, sorry? St. Louis, a couple other larger cities. And I don't know if St. Louis had a very large Jewish community, maybe. But so the very large Jewish communities had schools, yeshivas, were well established. Most of the smaller Jewish communities around the country, though, did not really have schools for Jewish education. Did not really have, kind of strong, vibrant communities. And so this idea arose where various communities began to build their own kollels, where essentially they would offer a group of, usually small group, 5 to 10 promising students who were looking to continue their studies. They wanted to become a rabbi. They wanted to continue their studies, but they needed a way to support their family. So they offered them to move to these communities, be part of a kollel. The community will pay their stipends for kind of support their families for 2 years, 4 years, or whatever it might be of studies. But meanwhile, they will bring a strong kind of Torah presence to the community. In the 1970s, many, many communities around the country and really around the world opened kollels, usually very small, usually 5 to 10 students. And these students then would study Torah, but not just study, they would also help the community. So they began, in many of these communities, the kollel members began classes, Torah classes for members of the community, offering to teach Torah to the members, and that way they got a chance to study Torah. They often also taught in the schools. They built schools in many places where there weren't schools. Many of these kollel students ended up becoming full-time rabbis in those communities. Many of them became full-time teachers in schools in their communities. Some of them built yeshivas, advanced yeshivas in their communities. And this really helped build Jewish life in many of the communities all across the United States and really all across the world outside of what was then the major kind of established Jewish communities, including here in Los Angeles. A couple kollels were built that helped build the community here in Los Angeles. The Chabad community also started kollels in various places with a similar kind of goal. In fact, in 1979, the Rebbe decided to found a kollel in Melbourne, in Australia, to help build the Jewish community over there. And 5 couples that wanted to continue their studies were chosen to go. My parents were among those 5 couples that were chosen to go to Australia, and they went to start this kollel. It was a 2-year program, and that's how my parents ended up in Australia. I was born there. They ended up staying in Australia. The kollel still stands today, and many, many, many people have gone through it over the years, many of which have stayed there. My parents ended up staying in Australia. They became teachers and continued giving classes and teaching Torah there, and still do till today. Yes?
Do we have one here in this community?
We do not yet, but maybe we should build one. We just need the funding for it. It's not cheap.
No.
But
especially here.
It definitely would be a great idea.
Rabbi, do I recall correctly that the Jewish community in Melbourne is very close to Melbourne's Chinatown also?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know where Melbourne's Chinatown is. I grew up in Melbourne.
You're being too kind.
I don't know.
I thought I remembered that they were close together, when I visited Melbourne.
I don't know. I don't think there is a Chinatown in Melbourne. So over the years, though, the Kollel, which again started as a federation of charities to support the people of the land of Israel, but became, since the 1950s, the term for advanced Jewish studies for people who want to continue their studies after yeshiva. So it also became a catchword for all advanced adult education. So various other kinds of kollelim were opened in many communities. People who did end up leaving yeshiva and building a career for themselves, whatever job they may be doing, wanted to continue their studies, as Jews have done throughout history. And So some did it on their own, some study in the base medrash in the house of study, but in many communities they opened a Kollel Erev, an evening Kollel, which essentially was a place where people can go and study not just on their own, but within a structure. Perhaps there were classes, perhaps there was a curriculum that they would study, perhaps it's a curriculum, and sometimes, and so people after spending a whole day working go to maybe spend some time at home with their family, and then go for an hour, 2 hours to a kollel to study in the evening. Some of these evening kollels might even offer a small stipend as an incentive for people to come back to study within this structure. For Jews, it's really been important for us to study throughout our lives. So therefore, another kind of kollel that has been built in various places is a kollel for seniors who are retired. Rather than wasting their time, rather than spending their time playing golf or mahjong, many seniors, Jewish seniors, take the opportunity to study Torah. And so the Rebbe built in Brooklyn and in other places a Kollel Tiferet Zakenim, or a kollel for seniors, to study and advance in Torah. So the Kollel, again, it began as an institution to support Jews in the land of Israel who were making the pilgrimage to Israel, and Jews in diaspora felt it a mitzvah to support them. But it then continued to become a organization or a school to allow people to continue their studies where they could no longer continue their studies without getting some sort of stipend to support their family. So it provided some sort of stipend, similar to what many universities now do, right? For postgraduate programs, where they'll give you a stipend for people who are studying in postgraduate schools to working on their PhDs in order to allow for advanced studies. And it is something that really took off. Well, it existed in Europe already in the late 1900s. It really took off in the 1950s, and it has really grown. It's become extremely successful. It's produced countless rabbis and Rosh Yeshivas, yeshiva teachers. In fact, I would say most rabbis and yeshiva teachers today have studied in Kollel. That's where they studied in yeshiva, and then they continued on in Kollel, and then moved on to becoming a rabbi. Now, even those that do not study full-time, even those that have moved beyond the Kollel, it's important to remember that that the theme is that we have to always continue studying Torah in our spare time. Study Torah whenever we can. And that is why one of the things that we have done at the JCC, although we haven't yet built a Kollel, one of the things that we have done is built adult classes. We have a number of adult classes. I know a number of you take part in them because of the importance of continuing our Jewish education and continuing our studies. And while we need to work, or some people are retired already, but whatever it might be, we kind of may not be able to spend our entire day studying Torah. Most people are not able to do that unless you're a teacher or something. But even rabbis don't spend most of their days studying Torah. They're dealing mostly with communal and organizational issues, or members of the community, so we don't get to study Torah most of our day. But it's still important to remember that Torah classes are central to Judaism, and as Jews, we have survived as a people and continue to survive because of our dedication to Torah, to continue studying. And so it's important all of you are here today, so you're here studying, and it's important to continue that, and also to invite others. If we know others that can study, maybe don't know that classes are available, a lot of people just don't know about it, then it's our obligation to invite them, to tell them, invite them to come. What I find is that people often, even if they do know about it, don't want to come because they want to come, but they don't come because they're uncomfortable. Nobody likes going to a new place that they've never been to before. It's that they don't know what to expect. It's very uncomfortable. So I've recommended this before, but I'm going to mention it again. The best thing is invite your friends, acquaintances, family, neighbors. Tell them to join you. Say, come with me. I'll go with you. And that way they will be a lot more comfortable. Bring them here. Bring them next Sunday or to any Sunday morning to our Torah classes or to many other Torah classes that we have throughout the week. Any questions? Yes, Adele.